Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isaiah. I'm a co-founder of Enemy Productions. I'm a vice president of Enemy Productions. And I'm here to talk to you about Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells. And I'm going to go in on the book by Rebecca Skloot. And I'm going to give a lot of the information that's given in the book, and I'm going to compare it and contrast it with the movie that came out recently. All right, first I'm gonna start off by giving some background on who Henrietta Lacks was. She was born in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. Her parents were, she was born Loretta Pleasant, and later her name changed to Henrietta. And the family was uncertain on how her name changed, but her parents had 10 children. Her mother died giving birth to her 10th child. And then after her mother died, Johnny Pleasant, who was her father, moved to Clover, Virginia, where his family lived, and her siblings were split up between his family there. And she ended up with her grandfather, Tommy Pleasant, who was also raising David Lacks. So she grew up with David Lacks, who later became her husband, and he was her cousin. So they grew up on the tobacco fields there. They worked the fields. And and later they got married. This is some more information on what they did. They also They also made money by helping the white farmers and pulling their crop for them. She had 2 children out of wedlock. Her first child name was Lawrence. Her second was Elsie. Elsie was they thought she was simple, but she had dementia, and she had mental disability, so they didn't really understand those things back in the day. So they just saw her as simple. But they ended up marrying her and David, and then they had 3 more kids after they were married. Elsie became too much for Henrietta to raise on her own, so she had to send her away to Crownsville Mental Hospital. That's in Maryland, and Dr. Mayat is going to talk more about that later. But so she went to a hospital for the Negro Insane. With the start of World War II, many blacks moved north to work in the factories, and one of the big factories was Bethlehem Steel, which was in Sparrows Point, Maryland, and David Lacks, which was Henrietta's husband, moved up with those people, and the deal was that he would move up and make enough money to buy a house and 3 bus tickets for her and her 2 children at the time to move up, and that's what happened. Henrietta was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is a malignant or a cancerous tumor of the cervix. The pap smear was a technique for diagnosing cervical cancer, in which they took pieces of the cervix or the cancerous tumor from the patient, and they observed it under a microscope. And this really lowered the amount of unjustifiable hysterectomies, because that was a big problem at the time, that doctors was taking out females' sexual organs and unjustifiably without the right diagnosis. The culture of research at the time was much different from how it is today. They often scientists would use patients from public wards and justify it by saying that was their payment for getting free medical care. And so that's a big problem that we see today, because it's not okay to just do things that will harm people's health because they're getting free medical care. So, and this was a quote from the book that says, Hopkins, with its large indigent black population, talk about John Hopkins here in Baltimore, had a dearth of clinical material because of all the black people. So they saw the black people as like a prime object for their research. In Henrietta Lacks' time at Hopkins and the start of the HeLa cells. These are three important figures. This is Howard Jones, who was her physician, who diagnosed her with cervical cancer and gave her a lot of her treatment. This is George Gay. He was the head of tissue culture research at John Hopkins. And this is Richard Wesley Talende, who was a cervical cancer expert at the time. And he worked at Hopkins also, and he was the boss of Howard Jones. So Howard Jones took the cells from Henrietta, and then Talende, who was his boss, gave them to George Gay, who successfully cultivated them. With these cells, they did not just grow on their own. They had to be cultivated, so they put them in a petri dish with something that's called a media, which is like food for the cells that helps them double and split and create more of itself. Here's some more background on Howard Jones. He was a pioneer of in vitro fertilization. He performed some of the first sex change operations, and he was regarded as a giant by his colleagues at John Hopkins. This is George Gay. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1899. He was the director of cancer research at Hopkins, and he built his lab there with his wife, Margaret. And they also found other techniques for observing cells with microscopes, and they could get film and photographs in that way. Howard Wesley Talende, he was one of the top cervical cancer experts in the world. He pioneered the use of estrogen for menopause, and he helped minimize unjustified hysterectomies, which we already talked about was a large problem at the time. The treatment for Henrietta was radium treatment. Radium is a radioactive metal that glows blue, and they would insert that into her vagina. And by doing that, the objective was that it would kill with its radioactive energy. It would kill the cancerous cells, but in doing that, radium also kills normal cells. So that was why it's not used as much today. Now they have chemotherapy, which we'll talk about more later. They also scraped 2 dime-sized pieces of her cervix off her study, and that was given to George Gay, who cultivated them and created the HeLa cells. In Gay's lab, they've been trying to grow human cells for years because it will allow them to do new types of research and new types of experiments to help advance the medical field at the time. And then after he finally cultivated them, 2 days after Henrietta left, they realized that the cells had grew. They had doubled. At first, they thought it was just a fluke, because before they had tested many other cells, they may have grown a little bit, but they eventually all died out. But with Henrietta's cells, they came back and they continued to grow for days in the culture with the media. And this was the biggest innovation of the medical field of all time. So George was very excited. He told all of his colleagues, and he began giving the cells to other researchers who would use them to make medical advances. The benefits were they were able to do things with these cells that they couldn't do to regular humans. So they were able to work with human cells without having to be moral and without having to work with actual humans. So they got to expose them to toxins, drugs, radiation, different infections, and they always had more. Whereas if they use human subjects, first it would be immoral, and the human subjects would die off, and that's a big moral issue. The first big contribution that HeLa made to the world was polio. Polio was a big epidemic at the time. It was killing children all around the world, killed thousands of people a year, and they needed these cells to test. Jonas Salk claimed to have made a polio vaccine, but he didn't have the right materials which he needed to test it. So he needed to mass produce these HeLa cells so that he can test them and make sure that his vaccine works. So they built a factory, and the factory was built at Tuskegee Institute, which was one of the first HBCUs. I'm sure a lot of y'all know about Tuskegee Institute. And it was built by 6 black scientists, and it grew. The factory grew to 35 scientists and technicians, and it created 6 trillion cells a week. And they distributed these cells all around the world to scientists who will use them for polio research. And in the end, the vaccine was successful, and Jonas Salk's polio vaccine worked, and that was a great contribution because it saved millions of children and people a year. Here are some more contributions. They were able to expose HeLa to other viruses such as herpes, measles, mumps, foulpox, and when they didn't necessarily find the cure for all of these through HeLa, but it definitely helped with the research, helped with cloning technology and vitro fertilization, radiation. They tested it on radiation's effect on human cells and more things. HeLa. This is just a really nice fact. HeLa was sent up into space on the second satellite ever to orbit the world in Sputnik 2, which was a Russian satellite, and it was also sent up in a NASA satellite, Discoverer 18. They were also used on they also tested HeLa cells' effect with atomic bombs and other things like that. The name Henrietta Lacks was never put out when it first became viral and it first became like something that researchers used. The name was not released until after George Gay, who was the cell culturist who first cultivated them in 1970. When he died, his colleagues at Hopkins created a tribute to him, and in this tribute, they released the real name of the person who they got the cells from, which was Henrietta Lacks. Before this, another name was going around, Helen Lane, which was a false name that somebody had leaked, and much of the public knew her as Helen Lane when that was not her real name, and George Gay never put that down. So after his death, all of that was finally cleared up. After Henrietta died of cervical cancer, she left behind 5 children. Elsie died at the age of 15. She went to Crownsville Hospital at the age of 10 and died at 15. But she also left behind 4 more children, and the cousins came to take care of them after she died, and the cousins often abused them, and they grew up in Baltimore, and so they had a really hard life growing up without a mother. This was another thing this was pretty much how they found out about how the family found out about HeLa. The HeLa boom was a phenomenon where scientists who were working with cell culture, they thought they were creating new types of culture other than HeLa, which were to use to test different drugs and different medicines. So they had 18 of them that they did not think was HeLa. But the problem was a geneticist named Stanley Gartler realized that all of these were infected with a rare genetic marker. And this genetic marker was only found in African Americans. So when he discovered this, and he found out that Henrietta Lacks was a black woman, he knew what the problem was. HeLa was coming in contact with all of these other cultures, and when HeLa had a tendency, when it got into culture with other cells, to take over. So when they thought they were creating new cultures, when in reality they were all HeLa, because HeLa was taking over, and that was a big problem. So they had different committees and things like that, all the scientists around the world, to try and solve the problem. So culturists had wasted millions of dollars in research trying to create new cultures, when in reality they were just working with HeLa. And the solution was found at the first international workshop on human gene mapping at Yale University. In order to solve the problem, they needed to be able to identify which cultures were infected with HeLa. And by doing that, they needed to know what genetic markers HeLa had. And to find that out, they needed to get blood from the family and find out which markers she had. So Victor McCusick, who was one of the first doctors to publish Henrietta's name, and he founded the world's first genetic department at John Hopkins, he sent Sue, who was an Asian woman, to contact the family and to get this blood so that they can stop this contamination. So she called David Lacks, who was Henrietta's husband and the father of all of her children. And he agreed because he believes that they were drawing blood to test his children for cancer, but there wasn't a test for cancer. There's not a test for cancer. So they pretty much deceived him, and they were really using it to help the medical field. So she collected blood from him and all of their children. They even sent doctors to the jail where her son Joe was, where he actually found Islam in jail. He changed his name to Zakaria, and so they sent doctors to jail just to get blood from him. Deborah, who was her oldest daughter, she was asked again to come and give blood by McCusick, and there she met McCusick, and she began asking him all types of questions because she was curious about what happened to her mother, because she never really grew up with her mother, so she was curious about what happened to her. She was curious about the HeLa cells, so she began asking a lot of questions, and McCusick, in a pretty rude way, just didn't answer her questions. He told her some simple facts about its help with polio and how it was in space and how they use it to test atomic bombs. And then he gave her a book called Medical Genetics and signed it. So he never really answered her questions. So this was a woman who was trying to find out more about her parents, the answers that he had, and he wouldn't give her the answers. And with the family believed that George Gay, who was the guy who cultured the cells, and John Hopkins made a lot of money on HeLa, but the truth was they never sold it. They gave it away for free to their colleagues. But there were other biotech companies that did make millions of dollars selling these cells that the family never saw a piece of. And so cell banks and biotech companies profited millions, and they found over 7,000 patents on their mother's genes, and that they had nothing to do with. Rebecca Skloot, this was the author of the book. She did her research at first. She first found out about the HeLa phenomenon in college. In I believe biology was her major, and something like that. And she found out about she couldn't find out more information about Henrietta, so she began doing some more research. She found out her name, things like that, and then she contacted a professor at Clark University. Patillo was his name, and he gave her the number of Deborah Lacks, who was the only one of her siblings that were really wanted to be bothered with it. She was very curious. She wanted to find out more about her mother, and the HeLa cells. So she began doing interviews with the family. She also interviewed a lot of the doctors that were involved with the HeLa cells, and she compiled enough information to make her book. The movie was produced by Oprah Winfrey was one of the producers, produced by many other people, but she was also the star actress. Oprah spent 8 years in Baltimore. I know a lot of y'all know about Oprah Winfrey, but she read the book and wanted to bring it to a larger audience, and that's what pretty much sparked off the movie. The main characters were Deborah Lacks and Rebecca Skloot, who was played by Rose Byrne. Here's pictures of them. The movie and the family. There was five of the family members. There was a lot of controversy behind the movie because 5 of the family members agreed to consult with making the movie. They gave some information to help make it as real as possible. But the oldest son, Lawrence, turned down the only $16,000 that they tried to give him to consult on the movie. So after all these biotech companies made money off of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells, now HBO, Oprah Winfrey, and all of these other people are going to make money off of the whole phenomenon, and they're only going to see a $16,000 piece. So he refused to consult, and they also wanted him to sign away his rights to talk about his mother. So that's another reason why he didn't comply. And other members of his family also complained about being portrayed as poor in the movie. I think, in my opinion, I feel like they were portrayed as poor in the book and not more than in the movie. But that's just when you watch the movie, you can make that decision for yourself. But the movie begins with showing some basic facts. They show newspaper clips, and one thing that they showed that was inaccurate was they showed a scene of George Gay who talked about the HeLa cells, and he called in the movie he called her Helen Lane. That's not true. The name Helen Lane came from a leak, a different source. It did not come from George Gay. He never put the name down, but he never said it himself. So that was one of the only contradictions that I found in the movie from the book. The overview of the book, the movie was mostly just Rebecca's research and how her interactions with the family, and she did. So she worked with Deborah a lot, who took her. She actually took Rebecca Skloot to Virginia, where Henrietta's gravesite, her tomb, and her home was. And they also went to the Crownsville Hospital where her sister Elsie was kept before she died, and that's where Deborah found out about the poor treatment that Elsie went through there at Crownsville. There was actually a picture that she found. It was supposed to be like a mugshot, I guess, that the white doctor was holding Elsie's face in the picture, and that was a really emotional part of the movie. And this was all accompanied by a bunch of flashbacks to show Henrietta as she was a hospital good person, and they always talked about how when people came, a lot of people came through her house because a lot of her cousins came through her house because she would cook for them and she was a really nice person, and flashback onto Elsie's poor treatment and a lot of the ways that Deborah and her siblings grew up, and that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.